Okay, so we're going to be going through Mind Shift, which is this presentation that we put together for you that's going to use principles of behavioral psychology to get a slight edge in marketing. And what I love about behavioral psychology is it actually just helps you everywhere as a human being, not just marketing. It's used in actually, as you know, as I was really kind of studying this stuff, like it applies to like parenting, it applies to like working with colleagues. So really excited about that. A little bit about myself. My name is Brandon Wetland. I am the CEO of Optimal. We are a growth marketing company based in Appleton, Wisconsin. We have a distributed team across the United States, and our business is growth marketing. So what we do for clients is tangibly help them increase their revenue. So we determine kind of where you're at and where you kind of want to go, and we help create a digital marketing strategy to help create tangible revenue growth. And the reason that we like to use behavioral psychology, because it really does kind of give you a slight edge. So I'm going to jump in to the presentation here. So before we get into kind of the tactical stuff here, I kind of want to talk about why this is important. And this is I don't know who to attribute this quote to, but oftentimes we think that we are, that we think rationally, and sometimes that we have emotions. And really what the science shows us is that we are truly emotional beings, and we sometimes think. And so what we're really trying to tap into is kind of the subconscious mind with the things we're going to be talking about today. And what's exciting about these principles is that they're universal. These principles are across, gender, across different cultures. These are universal principles that have been well studied and well documented. And what we're going to be focusing on, typically when we work with clients, that everyone wants conversions and to generate more results. And what that typically means is like we're really kind of focused on that one event. And what we're really going to be talking about today is everything that kind of leads up to that event. That's really where the true hard work kind of comes into play here, and why this is important. So my goal here is at the end of this presentation, you understand some of the theories that drive behavior, and that you can start to apply some of those theories to get an edge in your marketing or in business or in other areas of life, as I mentioned. And so what we're really trying to do is we're trying to have real impact. So a lot of times we call these vanity metrics, that people are paying attention to things like how many likes do I have, how many page views did we get, getting a certain amount of questions, Q&A kind of back and forth. And really what we want to focus on is the real human impact. Do people comprehend what it is that you're selling? Do they desire it? Are we hitting the motivators? Are we helping them with the decision-making process and removing friction and encouraging them to take action? So what we're going to be really focused on is how do we get real impacts for you and in your business? And so this is a little bit of a simplification, but I think it's a good one to kind of start with here. Is there's really kind of two core hormones that kind of drive a lot of decision-making that happens. So the first is dopamine, and dopamine is kind of the reward hormone. So anytime we kind of want something or desire something, anything that really kind of helps us survive a little bit better, that anticipation and reward is a big part of this. And one of the things that's really interesting is that social scientists are using this in social networking platforms. I forget the name of that Netflix documentary that came out recently, but highly suggest that, because what they're doing is they're applying dopamine and cortisol sort of mechanisms in their product to a really great effect. And so that kind of drives like desire. And the flip side, we have cortisol, which is kind of the fear hormone. So anytime we perceive a threat, you have to be careful. We kind of want to show desire. We also want to show, what things could look like if they kind of don't work with you. But you have to be careful, because too much cortisol can really backfire, kind of leads to some dark patterns, which we'll talk a little bit about. The other thing that's interesting about cortisol too is that it actually compounds. It actually builds and builds and builds, which is really important for things like movement, meditation, these sorts of things that kind of get rid of cortisol, which is really prevalent in our lives today. So think of cortisol as spice. You want to add just a little bit, but not too much, or it's not gonna turn out good. And so these two hormones kind of play into this kind of survive or thrive. So really, when you're communicating, again, not just in marketing, but in communication in general, we want to be sure that we're communicating in this mentality that we're showing people how to survive and thrive. And the reason that this is particularly important is because we just have way too much information. There's just too much for us to read or to consume. And so our brains are really kind of cued in and tied to these two things. Is this something that's going to help me survive, or is this something that's going to help me thrive? And if we didn't have that filter, our brains, I think, would just blow up, because there's just too much information. And so it's kind of like when you buy a red car and you start to see red cars everywhere. It's that same sort of filter in the brain. So we want to make sure that we're always communicating in a survive and thrive method. And so there's this book called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it's a really, really interesting book that talks about kind of the two systems of thinking. And they kind of talk about this as like the elephant and the rider. And so when I started this presentation, I talked about that we're emotional beings that sometimes think. The emotional part of us is the elephant. It's the 99% of all decisions, truly our subconscious, that the rider has very little power to direct the elephant. And so that system one thinking is your subconscious mind. And what's interesting about your subconscious mind is that it happens before comprehension. Typically, it's kind of the lizard brain, as they would call it, happens in a fraction of a second. It's your instincts, it's your emotions. And most of these kind of drive decisions that you make. And this is kind of your default system, unless you're being really intentional. System two is the thinking part of the brain, the rational, conscious part. And it actually makes very few decisions. And so what we really want to do when we're trying to construct behavioral psychology into marketing, we want to make sure that we're always targeting system one. People oftentimes over-focus on system two, and you will get there eventually, but most of the time people make an emotional decision and then justify it with rational thought. So we really want to be focused on system one here. So the idea here, and they kind of talk about this in this book, is that what you want to do is not kind of like try to force the elephant to move in certain directions. What you're really trying to do, it's all about removing friction. So if you've studied anything around habit formation and so forth, really what you're trying to do is just make things easier for the behaviors that you want and harder for the behaviors that you don't want. So a common thing here would be unhealthy snack food. They did a study where you just put that in a part of the fridge where you can't really see it, and you're much less likely to actually go for that food if you put the healthy options here. That's really important to do. And the reason is, kind of getting back to survive and thrive, is that from a biological standpoint, we're really trying to conserve calories all the time. So humans are naturally just really, really lazy, and we just want to be sure that we're removing friction. And again, that we're targeting that unconscious part of the mind. So what's really interesting here is this phenomenon that Robert Cialdini, which I'll talk about him in just a moment, he has this concept called click whirl. And what this is these are the unconscious things that we do, that when the trigger happens, this happens next, and then that happens. And what's really interesting is that they studied this first in the animals, that if there's certain things that you do, you'll always get this response from an animal, even if it doesn't make any sense. And so this is called a heuristic. It's a shortcut that we've taken to kind of conserve energy and calories that generally benefits us. Sometimes it doesn't, most of the time it does. And so what we want to do is tap into those heuristics and really kind of remove as much friction as possible so that these automatic responses happen more for you. Okay, so everyone here, we're kind of on the left over here. You're either a person, a team, brand, or a company. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to create influence through the media. So you can see there's various methods that we could do that: websites, social media, emails, text messages. And we're trying to influence the audience. So obviously this is not a person to person. There's like this digital intermediary in the middle here. But what we want to do is think about these as individual pieces, like how do we apply behavioral psychology to each of these pieces? And also how do we apply them to processes? So if you take a process like an e-commerce checkout, for example, you should be thinking about behavioral psychology across the whole process. So how do you, in the very beginning, make sure that you really are tapping into social proof with endorsements, clearly communicating value. And then as you get further into the buying process, risk reducers, anxiety, and trust become more important. So also think about it in kind of a micro and a macro view, that you want to analyze individual components, but you also want to analyze complete systems. And this also applies in, we're talking predominantly about marketing, but that obviously will translate into sales. These same principles will apply in the sales process, and you can actually kind of prep for greater success if you think about it this way. So let's talk about how people kind of make decisions. So first thing that happens is they concentrate and become aware of you, and so they need to focus on you. So what's important is that you need to get in front of people. You need to be interesting enough to at least kind of garner a little bit of attention. The next thing is comprehension. And so this is going to be understanding what you talk about. They are going to start to form kind of the mental models of like, what is it that you do? They're going to put you in a box. They're going to, oh, this is kind of like this thing. And that happens really in a fraction of a second. And we're not going to talk a lot about sales copy here, but one of the things that we see a lot of is that people really want to do kind of flashy sales copy that sounds really kind of buzzwordy. And that's really the opposite of what you want to do. Because if you don't pass this, like these fractions of a second, where people will comprehend what you do, they just check out, they bounce. And if you look at your website, you see that you have a high bounce rate. Typically, it's because people are not, they're just not sure what you do. And so then when they're not sure, too much friction, boom, they're out of there. So that's really important. So you got to make that really, really, really clear. Use street language, things that are anyone would understand, people out of your industry. The next thing that happens is people start to desire what it is that you have. Their passions kind of fire up. Emotions are going to drive those decisions. And what's interesting with motivators is if your product is really well known, you don't have to focus on motivators quite so much. So Apple's a good example of this. Everyone's familiar with what an iPhone is. You don't have to have a lot of motivators, but if you have a product or service that doesn't have that awareness, your motivator section actually needs to be substantially larger. So something to really think about is how aware are they of your product or service dictates how long the copy should be on your motivations. Then we move into deciding, and this is kind of an optional step because sometimes there isn't a logical next step that needs to be done. And then you can see trust really comes in at the end of this process. A lot of times people focus on trust in the beginning, but trust really comes in at the end. And trust is not a deal closer, but it is a deal killer. So you need to make sure that you're baking that in there. Once there's a sufficient trust there, because there's a risk, right? And that's why trust is important to kind of bridge that risk gap. Then they get into acting. So there's that next action that you want them to take, and then maintaining. So you want them to stay a customer kind of long-term. That's when that phase kind of comes in. So this is kind of the process, from a behavioral psychology standpoint, people go through from beginning to top. And so what you can do, this is kind of a fun test, is take your product landing page or your website and ideally go find someone who's unfamiliar. And there's kind of that, if you're the founder of your company and you built your product, there's that kind of that fallacy that everyone's going to understand it. So you really need to get people who don't understand your product or business and run them through this. Show them your landing page, give them a minute, 30 seconds, and then kind of score this. What was most prominent on the page? It's going to be really interesting. Typically what jumps out to people often isn't what you think about. Are they comprehending it? Did it kind of pass that initial test? What are the main benefits? Getting into deciding, how are we helping them make a decision? What's the trustworthiness? You kind of score that. This is something that's fairly easy to score on like a 1 through 10 scale. What's the next action you want them to take? Are they committed to using it long-term? And what would stop them from using it? So you can kind of do a quick audit on kind of the pieces of your process, understanding if you're missing any of these really core components in the decision-making process. The next thing here that's important too is you have to be careful, because what we're trying to do is we're trying to influence that kind of upper right quadrant here, this target outcome. So we're being intentional and we want a positive income. But oftentimes there's things that you do that have a positive outcome, but you didn't consciously try to do that. That's kind of an unexpected benefit. And then backfires is what we really want to be really, really careful of. So these are things that you didn't try to do, but they have a negative outcome. You want to avoid those. You definitely want to avoid dark patterns. And these are the things that, if you're familiar with a lot of the scrutiny that like Facebook and some of the bigger companies are getting into, is, and Amazon as well is really a big part of this, is they have really engineered dark patterns into their products and services. And so people, once they become aware that they become manipulated, they really, really strongly don't like that. So you got to be a little bit careful here and make sure that you're not influencing those dark patterns or backfire behaviors. Okay, so we're going to talk about Robert Cialdini and his book. So he's kind of the godfather of behavioral psychology, and he has created these 6 behavioral principles that he's created that we're going to talk about a lot in the rest of this presentation. And he is really well respected. There's a ton of research that's been done upon these. This has really kind of stood the test of time. And these are quite powerful. So these are kind of the 6 kind of building blocks to kind of think about, how do I engineer and bake these 6 principles into your business, into your marketing, into your product. And so we're going to be hitting each of these, starting with liking. And so liking is whenever someone feels like they have a shared attribute with you, you kind of create this liking effect. So PetSmart here, I think, did a great job. Their executive team, you can see that they all have pictures of their dogs. And so that's going to create this kind of common ground. And so, in a one-to-one kind of interaction, you're typically, small talk, you're trying to kind of find common ground. But think about that on your websites too. How can you actually show common ground? This becomes a lot easier when you have a very narrow target market. When you have a company that's trying to kind of market to multiple people, it could be hard to kind of generate that liking. But if you can focus on a niche, you can really hone in on those common attributes and create that liking effect that we're looking for. So what's really interesting, I think this is a powerful takeaway here too, is that flattery is a really great way to increase likability. Even if it feels like it's insincere flattery, which is kind of funny, it still has a positive effect that when someone gives us a compliment, we actually remember them more. We remember what they said more. And there's a lot of research that they did on this as well, that this actually translates to the digital experience too. So even though it's not a human, flattery can still be very, very, very powerful. So think about how can you inject that into your site. And a common way is like a thank you form. After you submit, oftentimes this is like this it's like you fill out a form and you're not really sure if it like submitted or not. Having a really nice thank you page, I think, is really powerful. You can also build this into your email marketing. So this is, I think, one of the easier ways to kind of take and build in the liking factor into your business here. The other thing too is to keep in mind using video forms and intros. I'm actually going to play a demo here really quick in just a moment to kind of show you what this looks like. But basically, if you're more familiar to a person, the more familiar you are, the more that they like you. And so video is a really powerful way to do this. And this is a product that we just started using called Video Ask. I think does a really good job. So I'm just going to play this. You should be able to hear the audio. Let me know, Noah, if you can.
Hey, how's it going? My name is Tara. I'm the founder of Biscuit. Welcome to the Biscuit Factory site. I'm so happy that you've landed here. I want to ask you a question. What are you struggling with? Why are you here, really? We struggle with marketing, social media, mindset. This is a big one. I want to know what your problem is right now with your business, with your creative work. I need to be able to send you things that will help you. So choose an option below of the 3 options below. Choose one and send me your stuff. Tell me, talk to me. I want to hear all the things. Keep creative and make sure that you join our free community on Facebook. The link is up here somewhere. Join the free community and
so then there's like little buttons at the bottom that you can click to start filling out a form. And to be honest with you, I'm not really sure what the Biscuit Factory does, but I feel an affinity to the founder of the company in a way that I wouldn't have, or certainly didn't get from viewing their website. And so that's a really powerful way to do that. Consider baking in those compliments and finding those common interests that that's going to build affinity with your target market. Trying to be as narrow as you can makes that a little bit more easy. So here's some examples of liking. You can see in the top left there, this is the author of I Will Teach You to Be Rich. It's got a really great photo. Kind of feel like actually photos is one of the strongest way to improve likability. When it comes to eye tracking that they've done, we fixate on people way more than we do on brands or on words. And so that's really important. Social media is another way to do this. So like responding really, really well to people, being personable, polite is a way to really influence that as well. Okay, so we're going to move into the second principle here, social proof. And we have a picture of Tim Ferriss here. Many of you are probably very familiar with him, but he does a very good job of baking in all of these things. I know he's a big fan of behavioral psychology, but you can see that 9,500 people rated his podcast 5 stars. That's important, right? And so social proof is essentially becoming aware that there's other people there. And so when you go to like a new city and you're looking for a restaurant, oftentimes you're going to go to the restaurant that has the most people because you think that that's going to be the better choice. And so whenever there's uncertainty or fear, we use this to our advantage. And in the digital world, that's a little harder to do. And so what we're trying to do is kind of make people aware that this is actually a social event, and there's other people that have cued that this is the right choice. And social proof I think social proof is perhaps one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful behavioral psychology component. And particularly if there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, we really, really heavily rely on this. There's some really interesting case studies in the book that they talk about just how, extreme that social proof can really influence behavior. And so think about like, if there's a lot of fear and uncertainty with making a decision to work with you, you want to really make sure that you really amp up your social proof quite a bit. And the other reason that this is important too is that people just don't trust brands. And so the research has shown that we trust people 12 times more than we trust brands. And so if you're not a familiar brand, you really got to amp up your social proof even more. So if you're a brand new startup, you're going to need this, I think, to really build trust and rapport with people. So some tips on social proof. What we're going to want to do is be precise. People believe precise numbers whenever possible. So Basecamp here underneath or give Basecamp a try. You can see 3,874 companies. Has a lot more than like 3,000 plus. People just trust that a little bit more. And then try to use emotional language in your copy when you're expressing social proof whenever possible. Okay, so social proof doesn't work everywhere. There's a few areas that it doesn't work. So if you're selling, luxury, or if your product is helping people kind of elevate their status, or helping them with signaling, this doesn't work because people actually just want to be unique. And so it is not kind of across the board. So be careful about that one. That could be kind of that negative backfire event if you're using social proof in your businesses in one of these arenas. Okay, so some different ways to think about social proof. You can sum it. So how many, so this is a quantified thing. So how many fans do you have? How many reviews do you have? How many videos have been uploaded or photos have been uploaded? You want to score it. So, 4 out of 5 stars, NPS or percent satisfaction scores, rank it. So if you're like the #1 in your space, or if you won an award, this is really quite powerful. You can say it, and this is where people come into play. Like, they're going to say it on your behalf, and they're going to leave video, photo. If you're going to do social proof, absolutely use photo. This is really important. This came out really clearly in the research that photos increase likability. So a lot of times when you go to websites, you see just like these faceless testimonials. They're really missing out on the power of social proof if you're not using a photo. And if you can, use video, which is quite powerful. And then sign it. So be specific here. Who is the source? Who's the person? Where was it? So location, if you have kind of a location focused business, you kind of like a geographic area, make sure that you're putting like the city and the state, try to make that as specific as possible. So show it. So any logo endorsements that you have, total thumbs up. And then shine it is like show it, but it's kind of like an elevated version of this. This might be like a custom award, Better Business Bureau award, Trustpilot. Those sorts of symbols actually elicit a lot of trust, which is kind of silly if you think about it, that like a simple lock can increase trust, but it works. I think we build these connections early on in life, and we see those things and it immediately generates those emotions. Okay, so in your social proof, what you can do is you can score it. So using these scorecard here, score a 3 if you're doing a good job, 2 if it's exceptional, 1 would be good. If you're just missing it, give it a 0. And if it's bad, it's a -5. So that's kind of that backfire event. So just go through and see, you kind of use the sum it, sign it, score it, to kind of brainstorm all the different social proof. And then once you kind of have like, okay, these are the social proof that I want to put on the landing page or the website, you can run through the scorecard, see like, is this credible, relevant? Is it pertinent to them? Is it attractive? Is it visual? And that can really help you inject social proof in a much more intentional way into the buyer journey. So one of the things that was really interesting, this is a non-marketing example. I have a few of those in here, but I think they're quite powerful to explain the concept here. So the UK actually was having a problem with people kind of turning in their tax returns. And so they would send these like threatening letters to them, like you need to pay or else. And it had kind of an incremental, it was like a 3% lift. But what happened is when they actually took like the city that you were in, and they said that 90% of the people that are in your specific city have turned their taxes in on time, they went from that very small percent to a very big percentage. And this actually generated $9 billion in total tax collected for them. So again, whenever you can make it super specific and whenever you can use this, it's going to really drive powerful decision-making. Reviews, this is kind of the go-to for this, is quite powerful. You can see we're using photos in this example. This is another social proof. This is a plugin called Proof Factor. This was new a couple of years ago. It can be potentially overdone, but what it does essentially is it will show you who has recently signed up for a webinar or to buy a product. It'll show the actual person and the location of that person, which again, as mentioned earlier, is quite powerful in decision-making. So that's a plugin that you can put in to help build social proof. And then user-generated content is really powerful too. Organic content people see with you using their products, testimonials, the star ratings, and so forth. Okay, moving into authority, which is kind of similar to social proof, but it's more elevated because these are not just, with social proof, this is more like, these are people like me. Authority is like, these are people who are really well respected in the industry. And so, the greatest authority thing I could think of is Michael Jordan endorsing the shoe, which was, obviously one of the most powerful endorsements that's been ever done. So expert endorsements, celebrities, actually the clothes that you use in the setting that you're in are cues as well. They did a study where people who actually presented with a or if doctors wore a white lab coat versus without one, the protocols that they prescribed had a higher compliance if they put on the white coat. So we kind of trust those symbols and those awards quite a bit. Okay, so the more recognizable, the better. I'm a huge fan of Brene Brown. You can see this is at the top of her landing page here. She's doing a really great job here. You can see that these are very well-known publications. And she even like took screenshots and kind of circled, this is like a top seller. This is really, really strong authority that she's done here. And again, I mentioned social proof and authority. They're very similar. And sometimes there's a little bit of overlap between these. Just keep in mind that social proof is going to be more people like you, and authority is going to be more like experts, perceived experts, well-known experts, celebrities, and so forth. So really good examples here. On the left, we've got Tesla's, they won this really well-known award. On the right here is Brian Dean. Brian Dean runs an SEO course that is, I'll actually mention this a few times because he does a brilliant job of using social proof. But he is a recognized expert. He even screenshots the Forbes article. He kind of highlights that one word. He does a really good job with that. All right, so I think the Apple Geniuses, kind of that uniform, the doctors of the white lab coat I mentioned, really powerful authority symbols, whenever you can do that too, kind of from a visual standpoint. All right, so moving on to reciprocity. So this quote, I really like this. So there's an obligation to give, there's an obligation to receive, and there's an obligation to repay. And what's really interesting about this is that it doesn't actually have to be equal. So for example, if someone gives you a small gift, it doesn't always have to be the same equal gift in return. And the idea here is that if you do something for someone else, they're more likely to do something for you. And I think this is really a powerful survival thing that we've done. We help take care of each other who kind of helped us out. And what's interesting here is that it's not quid pro quo. So it does not have to be equal. And there's an example that they had in the book where someone came up and kind of gave someone a free soda, and then later in the night asked them to buy lottery tickets. And the lottery tickets were 100 times more valuable than the cost of a free soda, but it substantially increased the compliance with people who did that because of that free small gift. We just talked about that one. And this is another example here. So, if you ever wonder why you get the free gift at the end of a meal, if someone gives you a mint, the research they've done shows that increases the total tip that you give by 3%. But you can see if they put 2 mints, it actually increases it by 20%. So this is an exponential increase. It does not have to be relative, which is really interesting with this. And Jeff Walker has a fantastic book. Definitely recommend that, checking that out. I think there's a lot of behavioral psychology components in here that you could use. And one of the things, and actually I'm a customer of Brian Dean, who used Product Launch Formula to a T. And the idea here is in Product Launch Formula is you give away an overwhelming amount of free stuff. So I actually signed up for Brian Dean's email, and every week he gave just extraordinary content you would pay for. And over the course of a few months, he had built up a ton of reciprocity. So then when he had a product to sell me, people were way more likely, and speaking from firsthand experience here, because of the value that he brought, I felt like I owed him to kind of buy that product. And so the sales pitch comes at the end. So give and then ask. So some tips on reciprocity that are a little bit counter to some of the things you've probably seen here. And that is that if you give people free information and then you ask for it, they're more likely to give back if you ask at the end. So if you have like a content offer or like a webinar and there's an email there, that is not reciprocity. Reciprocity would be, here is this free thing. And then after they have gotten the value, then you ask for the email at the end. And so putting call to action at the end of your content is a really great way to do this as well. Okay, so moving on to commitment and consistency. I actually talked about this one a little bit earlier here, a little bit of overlap with the last reciprocity here. But the idea here is if you ask someone for a small favor, and then they'll kind of agree to that, and then move on to then you ask for something that's a little bit bigger, and they're more likely to say yes to that because they've already committed kind of to the small thing. And so the idea here is that people want to be consistent, and they want to be consistent to themselves, but they also want to be consistent to other people. And the reason why this is important is that, if you're inconsistent, that's seen really as kind of a negative behavioral trait. And if you are extremely consistent, this is seen as a very strong behavioral trait. And so what's interesting is what we're doing here is when we talk about consistency, what we're talking about here is the fact that people are more likely to continue doing something if they've already made a commitment to themselves. And so there's a really great example of this here. This is for one of our clients where we actually built this quiz. And so instead of just saying like buy our product, what we did is we actually are helping them kind of figure out what they want to do or what product is kind of best suited for them. And so I'm just going to play this and you'll kind of see this quiz run through here. So they're putting in if they're male or female, and their height, and their weight, level of experience. And as this continues on, it's going to suggest a product for them. The reason why these are so powerful is because they've taken one small step, even though it's a small step to making a buying decision, that one small step exponentially increases their chances of actually buying the product. So always think about kind of this breadcrumb technique of how can you ask for something small that will lead to something bigger and bigger and bigger. And so there's a really great example of this where they asked people if they would erect this like gigantic drive safely sign in their yard. And most people said, no, thank you. I don't want to put that huge sign in my yard. And instead they took a different tactic with another neighborhood where they said, can you put this little sticker? It was like a 1x1 sticker in your front window of your house. And then they came back later and asked them if they could put up the sign. And this neighborhood had a 76% compliance. And so that is because they asked them to do something very small, and the smaller, the better. But that kind of creates this domino effect that you can then ask for the bigger item at the end. Some ways to kind of to do this is kind of like a dual opt-out. So you're starting to see this a little bit more here where there's an opt-in, but there should always be an opt-out. So when you say that you're opting out here, you're saying discounts aren't my thing. So that would be the opposite of kind of the view that you have of yourself. Most people really like discounts. And so people are far more likely to click yes when you can see that there's a secondary choice that's incongruent with their first perception of themselves. And so you can kind of see that a couple more examples of that here. And so that is commitment and consistency. Moving on to scarcity. So people want what is scarce and rare. And so they did this study where they had 2 jars, identical jars with cookies in them, identical cookies. And there's 10 cookies in one jar and 2 cookies in the other jar. And they surveyed a huge population of people and asked them which cookies are better. And over 90% said the jar that had 2 cookies was. And the reason is that we want things that are rare and scarce. And so whenever you can show kind of decreasing availability, people are going to want to take action on that. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a company that I've studied quite a bit. It's a company called MeUndies, become quite popular. But after you add something to your cart and then you leave, you'll actually get this email showing that your cart's going to expire. And what does that mean? It means absolutely nothing. But it did kind of get me to stop and think and consider if I need to take action. So scarcity can be artificial, and oftentimes it is going to be artificially constrained. Here you can see, countdown timers are quite a powerful way to do this as well. These are a really, really powerful way to introduce scarcity. The other thing here, going back to Brian Dean, his company is called Backlinko. They're using, again, that product launch formula. And so what's really interesting about this, he sells a course. It's a $5,000 course. It's a quite high ticket price, but you can only buy that product twice a year. In fact, I remember emailing them and saying, basically, take my money. I want to buy this course. And it was closed. Couldn't buy it. And it was only open for a very short period of time. And so they could very likely keep this open the whole year, but they have found that by creating artificial scarcity, they're able to influence and generate way more sales. And a majority of those sales come in on the last day, which is why you really want to, if you're running a promotion, that last day is going to be the key point to target on scarcity. So a couple other examples here. Amazon does a good job of this with, how many items are left in stock, total, discount that has a 60-second expiration date. These are quite powerful as well. Social travel sites do a phenomenal job of this. If you ever go on any of those sites, you'll see, other people have just booked this. They'll even show products that have been sold out recently. Those are kind of decoy products to kind of help you create more scarcity as well. Okay, so coming in for landing here, what we talked about today is behavioral psychology and how it can give you a slight edge in the work that you're doing. And that the real hard work of this really comes in before the conversion. So you want to really look at the different pieces that are part of your conversion funnel the processes themselves, and how can you consider the different decision-making points and how to layer in these persuasion techniques through that process. And remember that we're targeting the unconscious mind. So this is the unrational part of the mind. We're appealing to emotions and that system one, that's thinking fast and quick. And then just consider this as you're building your products. Try to, I think the products that do really, really well, digital products, are building this into the product day one. Think about this for the services that you offer and the media that you're placing your advertising on. And then take time to kind of assess this. I kind of shared a couple different scorecards. Assess where you could do better, and then bake in missing items. So this is kind of a continuous process. It's not going to be perfect right away, but over time can be quite helpful.